Section 7. Summary and Conclusions. The nature of war. War is not, as is widely assumed, primarily an instrument of policy utilized by nations to extend or defend their expressed political values or their economic interests. On the contrary, it is itself the principal basis of organization on which all modern societies are constructed. The common proximate cause of war is the apparent interference of one nation with the aspirations of another. But the root of all ostensible differences of national interests lie the dynamic requirements of the war system itself for periodic armed conflict. Readiness for war characterizes contemporary social systems more broadly than their economic and political structures, which it subsumes. Economic analysis of the anticipated problems of transition to peace have not recognized the broad preeminence of war in the definition of social systems. The same is true, with rare and only partial exceptions, of model disarmament scenarios. For this reason, the value of this previous work is limited to the mechanical aspects of transition. Certain features of these models may perhaps be applicable to a real situation of conversion to peace. This will depend on the contemporary with substantive rather than procedural peace plan. Such a plan can be developed only from the premise of a full understanding of the nature of the war system it's proposed to abolish, which in turn presupposes detailed comprehension of the functions the war system performs for society. It will require the construction of a detailed and feasible system of substitutes for those functions that are necessary to the stability and survival of human societies. The functions of war. The visible military functions of war require no elucidation. It is not only obvious, but also irrelevant to a transition to the condition of peace, in which it will be definition be superfluous. It is also subsidiary in social significance to the implied non-military functions of war. These critical to transition can be summarized in 5 principal groupings. Economic. War has provided both ancient and modern societies with a dependable system for stabilizing and controlling national economies. No alternative method of control has yet been tested in a complex modern economy that has shown itself remotely comparable in scope or effectiveness. Political. The permanent possibility of war is the fundamental for stability government. It supplies the basis for general acceptance of political authority. It has enabled societies to maintain necessary class distinction. It has ensured the subordinance of the citizens of the state, by virtue of the residual war powers inherent in the conception of nationhood. No modern political ruling group has successfully controlled its constituency after failing to sustain the continuing credibility of an external threat of war. Sociological. War, through the medium of military institutions, has uniquely served societies throughout the course of known history as an indispensable controller of dangerous social dissidents and destructive antisocial tendencies. As the most formidable of threats to life itself, and as the only one susceptible to mitigation by social organization alone, it has played another equally fundamental role. The war system has provided the machinery through which the motivational forces governing human behavior have been translated into binding social allegiance. It has thus ensured the degree of social cohesion necessary to the viability of nations. No other institution or groups of institutions in modern societies has successfully served these functions. Ecological. War has been the principal evolutionary device for maintaining a satisfactory ecological balance between gross human populations and supplies available for its survival. It is unique to the human species. Cultural and scientific. War orientation has determined the basic standards of value in the creative arts, and has provided the fundamental motivational sources of scientific and technological progress. The concepts that art express values independent of their own forms, and that the successful pursuit of knowledge has intrinsic social value, have long been accepted in modern societies. The development of the arts and sciences during this period has been corollary to the parallel development of weaponry. Substitutes for the functions of war. Criteria. The foregoing functions of war are essential to the survival of the social systems we know today. With 2 possible exceptions, they are also essential to any kind of stable social organization that might survive in a warless world. Discussion of the ways and means of transition to such a world are meaningless unless a. Substitute institutions can be devised to fill these functions, or b. It can reasonably be hypotheticated that the loss or partial loss of any one function need not destroy the viability for future societies. Such substitute of institutions and hypotheses must meet varying criteria. In general, they must be technologically feasible, politically acceptable, and potentially credible to the members of the societies that adopt them. Specifically, they must be characterized as follows. Economic. An acceptable economic surrogate for the war system will require an expenditure of resources for completely non-productive purposes at a level comparable to that of the military expenditures otherwise demanded by the size and complexity of each society. Such a substitute system of apparent waste must be of a nature that will permit it to remain independent of the normal supply-demand economy. It must be subject to arbitrary political control. Political. A viable political substitute for war must possess a generalized external menace to each society of nature and a degree sufficient to require the organization and acceptance of political authority. Sociological. First, in the permanent absence of war, new institutions must be developed that will effectively control the social destructive segments of societies. Second, for purposes of adapting the psychological and physiological dynamics of human behavior to the needs of social organization. A credible substitute for war must generate an omnipresent and readily understood fear of personal destruction. This fear must be of a nature and degree sufficient to ensure adherence to societal values to the full extent that they are acknowledged to transcend the value of individual human life. Ecological. A substitute for war and its function as the uniquely human system of population control must ensure the survival, if not necessarily the improvement, of the species, in terms of its relations to environmental supply. Cultural and scientific. A surrogate for the function of war has the determination of cultural values must establish a basis for social-moral conflict of equally compelling force and scope. A substitute motivational basis for the quest for scientific knowledge must be similarly informed by a comparable sense of internal necessity. Substitute for the functions of war. Models. The following substitute institutions, among others, have been proposed for considerable replacements for the non-military functions of war. That they may not have been originally set forth for that purpose does not preclude or invalidate their possible application here. Economic. A comprehensible social welfare program directed toward maximum improvement of general conditions of life. B. A giant open-ended space research program aimed at unreachable targets. Or C. A permanent, ritualized, ultra-elaborate disarmament inspection system and variations of such a system. Political. A. An omnipresent, virtually omnipotent international police force. B. An established and recognized extraterrestrial menace. C. Massive global environmental pollution. Or D. A fictitious alternate enemy. Sociological control function. A. Programs generally derived from the Peace Corps model. Or B. A modern, sophisticated form of slavery. Motivational function. A. Intensified environmental pollution. B. New religions or new methodologies. C. Socially oriented blood games. Or D. Combinational forms. Ecological. A comprehensive program of applied eugenics. Cultural. No replacement institutional offered. Scientific. The secondary requirement of the space research, social welfare, and or eugenic programs. Substitutes for the functionary of war. Evaluation. The model listed above reflect only the beginning of the quest for substitutive institutions for the functions of war. Rather than a recapitulation of alternatives, it would be both premature and inappropriate, therefore, to offer final judgments on their applicability to a transition to peace and after. Furthermore, since the necessary but complex project of correlation, the comparability of surrogates for different functions could be treated only in exemplary fashions at this time. We have elected to withhold such hypothetical correlations as were tested as statistically inadequate. Nevertheless, some tentative and cursory comments on these purpose-functional solutions will indicate the scope of the difficulties involved in this area of peace planning. Economic. The social welfare model cannot be expected to remain outside the normal economy after the conclusion of its predominantly capital investment phase. Its value in this function could therefore only be temporary. The space research substitute appears to meet both major criteria and should be examined in greater detail, especially in respect to its probable effects on other war functions. Elaborate inspection schemes, although superficially attractive, are inconsistent with the basic premise of a transition to peace. The unarmed forces variant, logistically similar, is subject to the same functional criticism as the general social welfare model. Political. Like the inspection scheme surrogates, proposals for planetary international police are inherently incompatible with the ending of the war system. The unarmed forces variant, amending to including unlimited powers of economic sanction, might conceivably be expanded to constitute a credible external method. Development of an acceptable threat from outer space, presumably in conjecture with a space research surrogate for economic control, appears unpromising in terms of credibility. The environmental pollution model does not seem sufficiently responsive to immediate social control. Except through arbitrary acceleration of current pollution trends, this in turn raises questions of political acceptability. New, less regressive approaches to the creation of fictitious global enemies invite further investigation. Sociological control function. Although the various substitutes proposed for this function that are modeled roughly on the Peace Corps appear grossly inadequate in potential scope, they should not be ruled out without further study. Slavery, in a technological, modern, conceptually euphemised form, may prove a more efficient and flexible institution in this area. Motivational function. Although none of the proposed substitutes for war as the guarantor of social elegance can be dismissed out of hand, each presents serious and special difficulties. Intensified environmental threats may raise ecological dangers. Myth-making dissociated from tar may no longer be politically feasible. Proposal blood games and rituals can far more readily be devised than implemented, and institutional combining these functions with the preceding one, based on, but not necessarily immutative of, the precedent of organized ethnic repression, warrants careful consideration. Ecological. The only apparent problem in the application of an adequate eugenic substitute for war is that of timing. It cannot be effectuated until the transition to peace has been completed, which involved a serious temporary risk of ecological failure. Cultural. No plausible substitute for this function of war has yet been proposed. It may be, however, that a basic cultural value determination is not necessarily to the survival of a stable society. Scientific. The same might be said for the function of war as the prime mover of the search for knowledge. However, adoption of either a giant space research program, a comprehensive social welfare program, or a master program of eugenic control could provide motivation for limited technologies. General conclusions. It is apparent from the foregoing that no program or combination of programs yet proposed for a transition to peace has remotely approached meeting the comprehensible functional requirements of a world without war. Although one projected system fulfilling the economic function of war seems promising, similar optimism cannot be expressed on the equally essential political and sociological areas. The other major non-military functions of war, ecological, cultural, and scientific, raise very different problems. But it is least possible that detained programming of substitutes in these areas is not prerequisite to transition. More important, it is not enough to develop adequate but separate surrogates for the major war functions. They must be fully compatible and in no degree self-canceling. Until such a unified program is developed, at least hypothetically, it is impossible for this or any other group to furnish meaningful answers to the questions originally presented to us. When asked how best to prepare for the advent of peace, we must first reply, as strongly as we can, that the war system cannot responsibly be allowed to disappear until 1. We know exactly what it is we plan to put in its place, and 2. We are certain, beyond reasonable doubt, that the substitute institutions will serve their purpose in terms of the survival and stability of society. It will then be time enough to develop methods for effectuating the transition. Procedural programming must follow, not precede, substantive solutions. Such solutions, if indeed they exist, will not be arrived at without a revolutionary revision of the modes of thought therefore considered appropriate to peace research. That we have examined the fundamental questions involved from dispassionate, value-free point of view should not imply that we do not appreciate the intellectual and emotional difficulties that must be overcome on all decision-making levels before these questions are generally acknowledged by others for what they are. They reflect on an intellectual level traditional emotional resistance to new, more lethal, and thus more shocking forms of weaponry. The understandable comment of them, Senator Hubert Humphrey, on their publication of On Nuclear War, is still very much to the point. New thoughts, particularly those which appear to contradict current assumptions, are always painful for the mind to contemplate. Nor simple because we have not discussed them. Do we minimize the massive reconciliation of conflicting interests with domestic as well as international agreement on proceeding toward genuine peace presupposes? This factor is excluded from the preview of our assignment, but we would be remiss if we failed to take it into account. Although no insuperable obstacle lies in the path of reaching such general agreements, formidable short-term private group and general class interests in maintaining the war system is well established and widely recognized. The resistance to peace stemming from such interest is only tangential, in the long run, to the basic functions of war, but it will not be easily overcome. In this country or elsewhere, some observers, in fact, believe that it cannot be overcome at all in our time, that the price of peace is simply too high. This bears on our overall conclusion to the extent that timing in the transference to substitutive institutions may often be the critical factor in their political feasibility. It is uncertain at this time whether peace will ever be possible. It is far more questionable by the objective standard of continued social survival rather than that of emotional pacifism, that it would be desirable even if it were demonstrably attainable. The war system, for all its subjective repugnance to important sections of public opinion, has demonstrated its effectiveness since the beginning of recorded history. It has provided the basis for the development of many impressively durable civilizations, including that which is dominant today. It has consistently provided unambiguous social priorities. It is, on the whole, a known quantity, a viable system of peace, assuming that the great and complex questions of substitutive institutions raised in this report are both subtle and solved, while still constituting a venture into the unknown, with the inevitable risks attained on the unforeseen, however small and however well hedged. Governmental decision tends to choose peace over war whenever a real option exists, because it usually appears to be the safer choice. Under most immediate circumstances, they are likely to be right, but in terms of long-range social stability, the opposite is true. At our present state of knowledge and reasonable inference, it is the war system that must be identified with stability. The peace system must be identified with social speculation, however justifiable the speculation may appear, in terms of subjective moral or emotional values. A nuclear physicist once remarked, in respect to a possible disarmament agreement, "If we could change the world into a world in which no weapons could be made, that would be stabilizing. But agreements we can expect with the Soviets would be destabilizing." The qualification and the basis are equally irrelevant. Any condition of genuine total peace, however achieved, would be destabilizing until proved otherwise. If it were necessary at this moment to opt irrevocably for the retention or for the dissolution of the war system, common precedents would dictate the former course. But it is not yet necessary. Late as the hour appears, and more factors must eventually enter the war-peace equation than even the most determined search for alternative institutions for the functions of war can be expected to reveal. One group of such factors has been given only passing mention in this report. It centers around the possible obsolescence of the war system itself. We have noted, for instance, the limitations of the war system in fulfilling its ecological functions and the declining importance of this aspect of war. It by no means stretches the imagination to visualize comparable developments which may compromise the efficacy of war, as, for example, an economic controller, or as an organizer of social allegiance. This kind of possibility, however remote, serves as a reminder that all calculations of contingency not only involve the weighing of one group of risks against another, but requiring a respectful allowance for error on both sides of the scale. More expedient reasoning for pursuing the investigation of alternate ways and means to serve the current function of war is narrowly political. It is possible that one or more major sovereign nations may arrive, through an unambiguous leadership, at a position in which a ruling administrative class may lose control of basic public opinion, or of its ability to rationalize the desired war. It is not hard to imagine, in such circumstances, a situation in such governments may feel forced to initiate serious full-scale disarmament proceedings, perhaps provoked by accidental nuclear explosions, and that such negotiations may lead to the actual establishment of military institutions. As our report has made clear, this could be catastrophic. It seems evident that in the event an important part of the world is suddenly plunged without sufficient warning into an inadvertent peace, even partial, and inadequate preparation for the possibility may be better than none. The difference could even be critical. The models considered in the preceding chapter, both those that seem promising and those that do not, have one positive feature in common, an inherent flexibility of phasing. And despite our strictures against knowingly proceeding into peace transition procedures without thorough substantive preparation, our government must nevertheless be ready to move in this direction with whatever limited resources of planning are on hand at the time, if circumstances so require. An arbitrary all-or-nothing approach is no more realistic in the development of contingency peace programming than it is anywhere else. But the principal cause for concern over the continuing effectiveness of the war system, and the more important reasoning for hedging with peace planning, lies in the backwardness of current war system programming. Its controls have not kept pace with the technological advances it has made possible. Despite its inarguable success to date, even in this area of unprecedented potential in mass destruction, it continues to operate largely on a laissez-faire basis. To the best of our knowledge, no serious quantified studies have been conducted to determine, for example, optimum levels of armament production for purpose of economic control at any given relationship between civilian production and consumption patterns, correlation factors between draft recruitment policies and measurable social dissidence, minimum levels of population destruction necessary to maintain war threat credibility under varying political conditions, optimal cycling frequency of shooting wars under varying circumstances of historical relationship. These and other war function factors are fully susceptible to analysis by today's computer-based systems, but if they have not been so treated, modern analytical techniques have up to now been regulated to such aspects of the ostensible functions of war as procurement, personal deployment, weapon analysis, and the like. We do not disparage these types of applications, but only deplore their lack of utilization to greater capacity in attacking problems of a broader scope. Our concern for efficiency in this context is not aesthetic, economic, or humanistic. It stems from the axiom that no system can long survive at either input or output levels that consistently or substantially deviate from an optimal range. As their data grow increasingly sophisticated, the war system and its functions are increasingly endangered by such deviations. Our final conclusion, therefore, is that it will be necessary for our government to plan in depth for two general contingencies. The first and lesser is the possibility of viable general peace. The subject is the successful continuation of the war system. In our view, careful appropriation for the possibility of peace should be extended, not because we take the position that the end of war would necessarily be desirable, if it is in fact possible, but because it may be thrust upon us in some form, whether we are ready for it or not. Planning for rationalizing and quantifying the war system, on the other hand, to ensure the effectiveness of its major stabilizing functions, is not only more promising in respect to anticipated results, but is essential. We can no longer take for granted that it will continue to serve our purposes well merely because it always has. The objective of government policy in regarding to war and peace, in this period of uncertainty, must be to preserve maximum options. The recommendations which follow are directed to this end.